Thanks for the kind introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to let me speak on this topic on varieties of cosmopolitanism: cultural, constitutional, contestatory, and social. So I think the paper that I'm going to present kind of is the prequel or the prelude to the things that you have discussed and will discuss in this conference, as I'm here interested in the conceptual groundwork, so to say, of cosmopolitanism. And that's why I, just for the sake to remember, brought this short overview that cosmopolitanism is, of course, not a new idea, but when we invoke such terms, such a loaded term as cosmopolitanism, today that we might refer to the history of political thought, and then we need to reconsider the most important historical influences, and these can be found in Stoicism and Enlightenment. I brought you some classical definitions here by Diderot in his encyclopedia project, where he says that a cosmopolitan is a stranger nowhere in the world. Then the other kind of huge influence on the idea of cosmopolitanism today is Kant's writing on perpetual peace and on universal history. And especially in the treatise on perpetual peace, Kant argues that such a peace would, in the end, in the future, would be achieved through a peaceful federation of republics and democracies, so to say. So in these classical understandings of cosmopolitanism, it contains at least a minimum of self-identification or motivation, not only to one's nation, to one's tribe or community, but rather to a whole or to the whole of humanity. In this sense, cosmopolitanism implies at least some cultural versatility, learnedness, and cultural openness. And then if there are positive sides in the history of political thought, then there are also critical or skeptic voices, and I brought you two from the kind that could have some cosmopolitan value. At least that's my reading both of Rousseau and Hegel. Rousseau says in his Geneva manuscripts on in preparation of the social contract, he claims that the cosmopolites is someone who, justifying their love of fatherland by their love of mankind, boast of loving everyone so that they have a right to love no one. And Hegel, in his philosophy of right, in a very specific section, he says a human being counts as a human as such because he's a human being, not because he's a Jew, Catholic, Protestant, Italian, German, etc. This consciousness, Hegel is talking here about an individual, which is the aim of thought, is of infinite importance, and it is inadequate only if it adopts a fixed position, for example, as cosmopolitanism, in opposition to the concrete life of the state. And this opposition is something that I'll end the presentation in 12 or 30 minutes or so. So that's why I bring this up right now. So the skeptical version asks whether cosmopolitans are selfish in their way of not having all motivations and all allegiances to the local or to the national. And Hegel's criticism is that the idea of cosmopolitanism has not produced binding political and legal institutions yet, so to say. So the criticism would amount to something like the political idea of cosmopolitanism would be empty. So this brings us to our current situation. Jump forward roughly 250 years. Everyday and extraordinary behavior is in many ways and senses border crossing or transnational. And as we've heard already throughout the conference, many of these everyday activities are mediated through digital media or through digital technologies. However, I would say that we do not necessarily engage in these practices because we think of these actions as cosmopolitan, but rather because we think of them as common under the good and bad conditions of a globalized world and our societies. I brought you some examples, and these are relatively self-explaining. So these problems of our political world, it's oftentimes commonplace to say that these political problems cannot primarily be solved anymore on the national level. However, this remains a nice talk, but it's not exactly our political and social reality yet. In theory, we oftentimes what social scientists have called a methodological nationalism. We'll come to that later on as well. And in political practice, we find something that I primarily would call organizational localism. That is federal and supranational political decisions, like in the EU, or think of the International Criminal Courts, need to be put on the ground locally. There are no binding and enforcing mechanisms beyond the state as of right now. So that all brings us to the view that cosmopolitanism is a multifaceted approach for rethinking all normative and social relations in formal and non-formal settings. So this brings me to the main task of this paper, to reconsider contemporary cosmopolitan political theory and varieties to advance the CCPT, as I call it here. CCPT is a normative enterprise in political philosophy over the last, let's say, 30, 40 years. And it's mainly argued and debated in the philosophy of political liberalism and in the literature on global justice, where the focus is on distributive justice, where goods and where the thought is how can goods and services be justly or fairly distributed within a nation state or globally. And so to say, this theoretical project fell on very fertile historical ground after what Fukuyama calls the alleged, or what he calls or thinks of the end of history, and historically the end of the Cold War. But theoretically, most conceptions, or pretty much all conceptions of contemporary cosmopolitan political theory share the following components. It's a view that we are not only citizens of a particular nation state, but also citizens of the world. Therefore, there are allegiances below and above the national level, and that we regard every individual with equal regard and equal moral worth. And this is translated in all kinds of taxonomies, typologies between ethical, moral, political, institutional, legal, jurisdictional, what have you. So basically, every paper you look at shifts the balance a little bit. I brought you just here one conceptualization by Sam Scheffler on cosmopolitanism about justice and culture. And here you get the tension that I want to put some focus in, so to say. He acknowledges that cosmopolitan about justice is about setting and coming up with the right principles and the right scopes for conceptions of justice. And I quote, in other words, it opposes any view which holds as a matter of principle that the norms of justice apply primarily within bounded groups comprising of some subset of the global population. On the other hand, cosmopolitanism about culture is a cultural view of the self and his and her and their social and cultural relations, where it's mostly about the well-being of the person and their relations. And now what I want to do in the next couple of minutes is highlight a few attempts to advance, so to say, a little bit from this classical contemporary cosmopolitan political theory. The first part is cultural cosmopolitanism. This is by philosophers like Kwame Appiah or Jeremy Waldron, who develop a cultural approach to cosmopolitanism. They very much set cosmopolitanism within the context of the current phase of cosmopolitanism, and Waldron stresses that as paradoxical as it might sound, that law is a universal medium, even though the realm of application is bounded. For Waldron, cosmopolitanism is essentially a theme of cultural lifestyles, and the current human condition is cosmopolitan, as he says in a number of papers. Waldron cites and mentions cities and metropolitan regions as cosmopolitan hubs where humans interact and mingle. And this is an astonishing quote. Humans are curious, and I quote, humans are curious and adventurous animals. They travel, they migrate, they trade, they fight, and they plunder. And they report back what they have found out about the ways in which others live and trade and fight, etc. They bring back tales of exotic customs as well as the exotic goods they have purchased or stolen. On the other hand, this was the cosmopolitanism about the self, so to say. The cosmopolitanism about justice is transformed, so to say, in the constitutional approach by thinkers like Sheila Ben Habib or the philosopher Jürgen Habermas. And they both look at the overarching trajectory of something like cosmopolitan norms emerging out of the historical experiences of mass atrocities in the first half of the 20th century. And in their contributions, Ben Habib and Habermas shift their focus between democratic theory, legal theory, and the public sphere and an engaged civil society. Ben Habib puts it in her important book from 2006, Cosmopolitan Norms of Justice. Whatever the conditions of their legal originations accrue to individuals as moral and legal persons in a worldwide society. So now the third variety that I want to highlight is a contestatory. And this is brought forth by thinkers like Etienne Balibar or James Ingram, who emphasize that within cosmopolitanism, there needs to be a basic democratic, so to say, a radical democratic practice of contestation. So to say, Balibar utilizes cosmopolitanism to articulate the tensions within universalism and particularism. This is why contestation and shifting borders are important in his contributions. Then Balibar, in many smaller pieces, asks whether Europe and European citizenships need something like a people, like das Volk, to be emergent as well, whereas James Ingram favors a more politicized version of the generativity, so to say, of norms that are contested from below. He says that cosmopolitanism needs to be articulated and enacted locally, and that cosmopolitan agents are part of the struggle, and he emphasizes struggles from the global south, so to say. However, my mild criticism, I'm pretty much on board with the three varieties in some degrees, of course, that in this variety, I see the problematic that the radical democratic conceptualization, which highlights contestation, conflates cosmopolitanism with politics. So if everything is cosmopolitanism, nothing is anymore, and everything and everywhere is politics, these things become undistinguishable, and that's not really good for concepts. So what we could say, and I am in the last part of the talk, and I probably need 2 more minutes, is that political philosophers in general have issues when the world does not meet their thought experiments. What I'm arguing is that the cultural, constitutional, and contestatory varieties of cosmopolitanism go beyond a little, at least to some extent, the blindness towards the political and social world that we find in pure analytic political philosophy. However, my paper and my approach is a plea for political theory and the philosophy of cosmopolitanism to take the social world more serious and to take clues from sociology and social theorists who've been discussing cosmopolitanism, like Greg Calhoun, Gerard Delanty, and the late great Ulrich Beck. So my attempt to socialize, so to say, cosmopolitanism has 2 levels. First, the practice level is that it's not only individuals and states who have rights and duty towards each other, but that cosmopolitan studies should also look at experiences and social practices of participants in global affairs on local and higher up levels, so to say. And this macro level can be looked at and further strengthened by Ulrich Beck's social theory of cosmopolitanization, which focuses on processes, dynamics, and developments in global society. And exactly. So this was the my methodological part that I envisioned, so to say, as a social cosmopolitanism. And then there's a practice, so to say, that I'm for the moment calling cosmopolitan consciousness as awareness and solidarity. Here again, it's the idea that modern democracies are an exercise in collective self-determination, but that every collective needs some boundaries to create some sense of civic solidarity, whereas cosmopolitan solidarity, if we want to create something, cannot fall back, so to say, on enforceability and on bindingness. That's why I find the quote here on the bottom: civic solidarity is rooted in particular collective identities. Cosmopolitan solidarity has to support itself on the moral universalism of human rights alone. So if the socialized account of cosmopolitanism is to be summarized in one sentence, it would look something like this: if our political and social world has changed, political theory and philosophy by extension needs to catch up. So what I've presented here is a plea for political theory to look where cosmopolitan social life really takes place. And we heard about this in the conference thus far. Cosmopolitan social life takes place in cities, in classrooms, on playgrounds, in workplaces, and everywhere where people can meet, so to say. Cosmopolitan social life happens with people that you've known all your life, or that you're meeting them just for the first time. It happens in languages that you speak and languages that you can't even imagine to understand. And cosmopolitan social life is strengthened and furthered through digital media, which generally lowers barriers to access to information and to participation. This account of cosmopolitanism that I envisioned and that I see in many of the, or probably in all contributions of this conference, is a perspective which creates awareness, care, and concern for others. And the importance is not for near others, but also for distant and unknown others. Cosmopolitanism doesn't need to be thought in the big gestures. Rather, cosmopolitanism should be further conceptualized through really existing social practices. Thank you so much.